In the beginning, there was no beginning. There was only the unlight, the patient, velvet void that was not an absence of illumination but a presence of pure, unvibrated potential. It was the ink before the word, the silence before the note. This cosmic dark was thick, viscous, a sea of quiescent thought that held within its boundless depths the sleeping geometries of all that would ever be. Sound did not travel through this expanse, for there was nothing to carry it. Instead, there was a resonance, a single, perfect hum that was the universe contemplating its own singularity. It was a chord of absolute unity, a thrumming that was both question and answer, cause and effect, held in a state of eternal, unblinking equilibrium. Eons, as a concept, had not yet been born. Time was a coiled serpent, swallowing its own tail, its scales, the shimmering dust of nascent stars not yet willed into fire. Within this pregnant emptiness there was a will. It was not a personality, not a being with form or name, but an intelligence as vast and as fundamental as the darkness it inhabited. It was the dreamer of the cosmic dream, and the dream was just beginning to stir. Its thoughts moved with the glacial pace of galactic formation, ripples of intention spreading through the plenum, causing the first faint perturbations in the perfect stillness. These were not acts of creation, not yet. They were the slow inhalation before the first word is spoken. One could almost feel the texture of this place. It was the cold, smooth feel of polished obsidian, yet it held a latent warmth, the promise of a billion suns. The silence was a pressure against an ear that did not exist, a heavy blanket woven from gravity and possibility. Occasionally a tremor would pass through the void, a thought of a different timbre, a musing on form, on separation, on the concept of two where there had only ever been one. These tremors were the first hints of dissonance, the first suggestion that the perfect, monolithic hum could be fractured into a symphony. The darkness itself seemed to hold its breath, the infinite potential of its being tightening like a string on a cosmic lyre, waiting for the finger of the divine to pluck it. The tension was not one of fear or anticipation, but of imminence. It was the feeling of a dam about to break, not with a roar of water, but with a flood of reality. The universe was on the precipice of becoming, and the atmosphere was thick with the ozone of that impending miracle, a deep and terrifying silence pregnant with the thunder of creation. The stage was being set, not with light and matter, but with the establishment of the laws that would govern them, etched into the fabric of the void by a consciousness that was everything, and for a moment longer was still content to be nothing. From this will, this singular consciousness dreaming in the dark, came the breath. It was an exhalation of impossible duration, a sigh of creative force that pushed the darkness back upon itself, not with light, but with purpose. Within this breath, the concepts of time and space unfurled like the petals of a lightless flower. The coiled serpent of eternity unspooled, and its linear path created the river of past, present, and future. The single point of the void expanded, creating dimension, direction, and the potential for distance. Into this new framework, the will poured the first substance, the clay. It was not mere soil and water, but the protean stuff of existence, a quantum loam rich with the memory of the unified hum. It was matter imbued with a fragment of the divine thought, a physical medium that longed for the cohesion it once knew in the mind of its creator. And from this clay, humanity was sculpted. They were not a mere afterthought, but a deliberate experiment in separation. The will, in an act of cosmic curiosity, fractured a sliver of its own unified consciousness and embedded these luminous shards into the vessels of clay. This was the origin of the first language. It was not a system of grunts or symbols, but a silent, telepathic resonance, a direct connection to the fundamental grammar of the universe. It was the language of making. When they thought of stone, they understood its crystalline structure, its weight, its history, its potential. When they thought of water, they felt its flow, its thirst-quenching power, its bond with the moon. Their minds were a single harmonious network, a chorus singing the same song of existence. They could build, weave, and shape the world with an effortless grace because their intentions were perfectly aligned, their knowledge instantly shared. There was no I, only we. There was no misunderstanding, no deception, no loneliness. They were fingers on a single creative hand, but the shard of divine light within each soul was a dangerous inheritance. It remembered, on a level deeper than thought, the singularity from which it had been torn. It remembered the perfect, all-encompassing unity of the cosmic will. This memory was a dull, persistent ache, a ghost of a limb that had been amputated. It manifested as a profound, unnamed yearning, a sense of exile. They walked upon the green earth, under the blue sky, but felt they were strangers in a land that was not their true home. They looked at the stars, those pinpricks of fire in the vast, silent dark, and they did not see distant suns. They saw the ceiling of their prison. They felt the pull of their origin, a spiritual gravity drawing them upwards, back towards the source of the hum. This yearning was the seed of their ambition. They were gods trapped in flesh, fragments of infinity confined to the finite, and the dissonance was becoming unbearable. The philosophical weight of their condition pressed upon them. Were they custodians of the world or exiles from heaven? Was their purpose to tend this garden of creation, or to use its materials to build a bridge back to the mind that had dreamed them into being? The ache for reunion began to curdle into a form of paideia belief that they, the children of the clay, had the right and the power to reverse their own creation, to ascend and re-merge with the will, not as supplicants but as equals. The idea began not as a spoken decree, but as a shared, silent consensus that bloomed in the collective mind of humanity. It started on the plains of Shinar, a vast, flat expanse of sun-baked earth that felt like the floor of the world, a stage for a grand gesture. Here, the yearning finally crystallized into a plan, a physical theorem of ascension, the Tower. From the perspective of Nimrod, the architect of this grand defiance, the vision was one of sublime, mathematical purity. He did not see brick and bitumen, he saw a tangible prayer, a syllogism of mud and fire aimed at the heart of heaven. Standing on the designated ground, the dust swirling around his ankles, he could feel the thrum of a million minds focused on his own. His thoughts were not his alone, they were the focal point of the human will. The base must be as wide as a mountain's memory. The thought resonated, and 1,000 overseers understood instantly, their minds grasping the sacred geometry without a single word spoken. Each brick, a solidified breath of our shared purpose. Each layer, a step closer to undoing the great separation. For Nimrod, this was not hubris, it was a holy imperative, the logical conclusion of their existence. He felt the divine spark within him burn hotter than any kiln, a brilliant, furious light demanding to be rejoined with its source. The sky was not a boundary, it was a veil to be pierced. From the ground, in the heat and the dust, stood Kale, a bricklayer. His hands, caked in the dark, rich mud of the river, moved with an unconscious grace. He felt no burning ambition like Nimrod, no philosophical torment. He felt only the profound joy of perfect communion. He would reach for a brick, and a hand would be there to offer it. He would need mortar, and a trowel laden with the black, sticky bitumen would be extended before his mind had even fully formed the request. The rhythm of the work was a symphony. The slap of wet clay, the scrape of the trowel, the soft thud of a brick set in place, all of it merged into a single percussive heartbeat of a united people. He would look up along the impossibly rising curve of the structure and feel a sense of belonging so complete it was dizzying. He saw his own sweat, his own labor, his own soul integrated into a form that was greater than any individual. He worked not to challenge God, but because the work itself was a state of grace, the most perfect expression of the unity that defined his entire existence. The tower was simply the shape their oneness had decided to take. He was happy. He could not conceive of being otherwise. But there were those who felt a different vibration. Lyra, a priestess whose mind was more attuned to the subtle resonances of the world, felt a growing tension. As the tower climbed, stretching its shadow longer and longer across the plain with each passing day, she felt the sky change. The air grew thin, not just with altitude, but with a kind of spiritual pressure. The unified hum of humanity, once a gentle and harmonious chord, was sharpening in pitch, becoming a single, demanding note that seemed to push against the silence of the heavens. She would stand at the base of the colossal structure at twilight, when the sun bled across the horizon, and feel a deep tremor, not in the earth, but in the fabric of being. It was as if their collective will was creating a strain, bending reality around its focal point. She looked at the faces of the workers, illuminated by the fires of the kilns, and saw a rapturous, almost ecstatic glow in their eyes. The soft ache of exile had transformed into a fever of ascent. They were no longer just building, they were willing themselves upward, and Lyra feared what might happen when an immovable will met an unstoppable desire. The world felt brittle, like glass about to shatter from a sound it was not meant to endure. The tower had become a wound in the sky. It was a needle of baked earth and human defiance, stitching the terrestrial to the celestial. Its peak wreathed in clouds that now seemed to cling to it, as if the heavens themselves were being pulled down by its immense gravity of purpose. For the people below, the world had shrunk to the base of their creation. The horizon was no longer a line between earth and sky, but a circle defined by the tower's ever-present silhouette. The work had reached a fever pitch. The silent, shared language of making was a torrent of pure intention, a river of consciousness flowing up the spiral ramps, carrying with it the endless supply of bricks, each one a hardened prayer. It was on a day when the sun hung directly overhead, a white-hot eye in a sapphire sky, that the resonance of the universe finally altered its tone. The change was not first perceived by eye or ear, but by the soul. Deep in the void, the singular, dreaming will turned its attention. It was not an act of anger, but of profound cosmic notice. A flaw had appeared in the grand tapestry. A single thread, the unified mind of humanity, was pulling itself loose, attempting to reweave itself into the pattern in a place it did not belong. The universe, which had hummed in a single, stable chord since the first breath, now registered a dissonant, rising frequency. A note of rebellion. The descent was not a movement through space, but a warping of it. The sky above the plains of Shinar did not open. It curdled. The perfect crystalline blue began to shimmer, to bend at the edges as if viewed through immense heat. But there was no heat. Instead, a profound cold began to settle, a cold that did not chill the skin but froze the marrow of the soul. Time itself began to coagulate. The rhythmic swing of 1,000 hammers slowed, their arcs stretching into agonizing syrup-like slowness. The dust motes, dancing in the sunbeams, hung suspended in the thick, silent air. The constant, internal hum of the shared human mind, the very medium of their existence, began to waver, to fill with a terrible, alien static. Kale was on the uppermost tier, a place of wind and vertigo, so high that the people at the base were mere specks of coordinated motion. He held a brick, its baked earth warmth a familiar comfort in his hands. He was turning to place it, his mind already sending the silent, effortless request for mortar to his partner, a man named Elam, whose thoughts had been as familiar to him as his own for his entire life. He looked at Elam, his friend, his brother in the great work. And in that instant, the presence arrived. It was not a light or a sound, it was a pressure, a deep, invasive force that pressed in on their collective consciousness, not from without, but from within. It was as if a divine finger had reached directly into the shared river of their minds. It did not seek to dam the river, but to shatter its essence. Kyle's thought a simple, pure concept of mortar, pass it to a fractured. The word, the idea, the very meaning of mortar exploded in his mind into 1,000 glittering, useless shards. One shard was a guttural rasp, bitumen. Another was a soft, sibilant hiss, asphaltos. Another, a clipped, hard sound, shamar. They were all a meaningless jumble, a cacophony of alien noises that held none of the object's true essence. The bridge of understanding between his mind and Elam's, a bridge that had been as solid as the tower itself, evaporated into mist. He looked at Elam's face, and for the first time in his life he saw a stranger. The familiar landscape of his friend's mind was gone, replaced by a wall of sheer, terrified incomprehension. Panic seized Kale's heart. He opened his mouth to speak, to cry out the silent name of Elam, but what emerged was a strangled, harsh syllable he had never heard before. Gresh Elam flinched back, his eyes wide with a primal fear Kale had never witnessed. Elam's own mouth worked, and a torrent of wet clicking noises spilled out, sounds that felt like stones rattling in a dry gourd. They were looking at each other, two minds that had been intertwined moments before, now separated by an impassable chasm. The horror of their sudden, absolute solitude was a physical blow. All across the tower and down on the plains below, the same schism was occurring 1,000,000 times over. The single mind of humanity was being deliberately, meticulously shattered. The great, unified chorus was broken into 1,000,000 shrieking, terrified solos. A man reaching for a rope found he no longer knew the concept of rope, only a sound in his head, cord, while the man next to him knew it as Hevron, and neither sound meant anything to the other. The perfect, synchronous rhythm of the work collapsed into a pandemonium of dropped tools, panicked shouts, and clattering bricks. A foreman, his mind a storm of orders that could no longer be transmitted, waved his arms frantically, but his gestures were now ambiguous, threatening. A woman cried out for her child, but the name that came from her lips was a foreign sound, and the child, hearing only a frightening noise, ran from her in terror. The language of making was dead. In its place was a maelstrom of babble, a curse of individuality. The tower, which had been a symbol of their unity, now stood as a colossal tombstone for it. Under the weight of this new, profound disarray, the structure itself seemed to groan, the bonds of bitumen seeming to weaken as the will that held them together disintegrated. The single note of their ambition had been shattered into a spectrum of chaotic noise, and the music of humanity was over. All that was left was a terrifying, incomprehensible din. As the divine pressure receded, it did not leave peace in its wake, but a ringing, hollow silence. The sky, which had warped and shimmered, snapped back into its familiar, indifferent blue. The sun beat down with a new and brutal honesty. Time, released from its viscous prison, rushed forward again, and the chaos that had been born in slow motion erupted into full, frantic life. The immediate aftermath was a sensory hell. The air, once filled with the silent hum of shared thought, was now thick with 1,000 different noises, a wall of meaningless sound that clawed at the ears. Kale stood frozen on the high scaffolding, the brick still clutched in his hand, now impossibly heavy. He looked down at the scene below. The perfect, swirling patterns of workers had dissolved into panicked, scattering clumps. Fights were breaking out. A man pushed another, shouting in a sharp, barking tongue. The other man, his face a mask of bewildered fury, responded with a low, guttural roar. They were fighting over a misplaced tool, a misunderstanding that, an hour before, would have been impossible. He saw a team of men who had been hauling a great stone block let go of their ropes. Their shared strength was gone, their coordination shattered. The block slid, gathered momentum, and smashed into a lower level of the tower, sending a plume of dust and shattered brick into the air. The sound of its impact was a dull, final thud, like a gavel ending an age. He dropped the brick. It clattered on the planks at his feet. The simple sound was jarring, isolated. Every sound was isolated now. Every footstep, every cough, every terrified whimper was a singular event, no longer part of a greater whole. The world had become a place of sharp, painful edges. He looked for Elam, but his friend was gone, lost in the terrified crowd scrambling down the ramps. Kale was utterly, terrifyingly alone. He was an island, a fragment, a consciousness trapped behind his own eyes. He tried to think, to form a plan, but his thoughts felt small and thin, lacking the immense, reinforcing power of the collective. He made his way down, buffeted by strangers whose faces he had known his whole life. He would see a familiar set of eyes and feel a flicker of hope, but when their mouths opened, the alien sounds that emerged would extinguish it. He was in a city of ghosts. The great kilns, which had burned day and night like captured suns, were now being abandoned, their fires left to die out. The quarries fell silent. The fields of half-made bricks lay baking and cracking in the sun. The entire machinery of their civilization had ground to a halt in a single, silent moment. When he reached the bottom, he found his family's dwelling. He saw his wife, Shira, her hands pressed to her temples as if to silence the noise in her own head. He ran to her, his heart aching with a need for the comfort of her familiar mind. He called her name, but the sound that left his lips was not her name. It was just a sound. Shira, he tried to think, to project, but the thought hit the inside of his own skull and died there. She looked at him, her eyes filled with the same fear and alienation he felt. She spoke, and her voice, once the most beautiful part of their shared mental landscape, was now a string of soft, incomprehensible syllables. They reached for each other, holding on tightly, but it was the desperate embrace of two drowning people, not the effortless merging of two souls. Their minds, which had once been open to each other, were now locked boxes, the keys lost forever. This was the new reality, a world of a million tiny prisons, each populated by a single, lonely mind. The scattering did not happen in a day. It was a slow, agonizing bleed. In the weeks that followed the Great Shattering, the people of Shinar huddled in frightened, confused clusters. The grand, abandoned tower loomed over them, a constant, silent accusation. It was no longer a monument to their ambition, but a headstone marking the grave of their unity. Hunger began to set in, for the effortless coordination of farming and distribution was gone. The intricate systems of their society had relied entirely on the first language, and without it, they were helpless. The new tribes were born of accidental phonetics. A group of people would discover, through trial and desperate error, that the garbled sounds they made were similar enough to form a rudimentary vocabulary. A family would be torn apart, the father's new tongue a series of harsh clicks, the mother's a lilting melodic flow, the child's a collection of deep, resonant hums. They would look at each other with love and longing, but could no longer cross the void that had opened between them, so they would drift apart, seeking the solace of the familiar, the comfort of being understood, however crudely. These new-forged clans, bound by the fragile threads of their broken languages, began to look upon each other with suspicion. The tower, the great common project, became a source of contention. Who did it belong to? Who was to blame for its failure? The memory of the before. Time began to fade, distorted by the new filters of their fractured minds. The story of their shared purpose was retold in 100 different ways, in 100 new tongues. In one version, it was a tale of divine punishment for their arrogance. In another, a story of a trickster god who sowed discord out of jealousy. The pristine, unified memory of their true history, the yearning to reunite with their source, was lost. It became a myth, a children's story, its profound cosmic tragedy reduced to a simple moral lesson against pride. The ripple effects spread outward from Shinar like the cracks in a shattered pane of glass. The tribes began to migrate, seeking new lands where they would not have to look upon the accusing finger of the tower or the alien faces of their former brethren. They moved north into the mountains, south to the sea, east and west across the plains. With each generation, the new languages diverged further, solidifying into distinct cultures, distinct histories, distinct peoples. The concept of we, which had once encompassed all of humanity, shrank. It now meant only we who speak this tongue. Everyone else became them. The seeds of nations, of empires, of war, and of prejudice were sown in that single moment of divine intervention. The human experience, once a singular, majestic river, was now a delta of 1,000 streams, each carving its own path, each believing it was the one true course, forgetting utterly that they all came from the same source. The world was now a tapestry of borders, both visible and invisible, woven from the threads of misunderstanding. This was the deeper consequence, not just the loss of a language, but the loss of the knowledge that they were ever one. And so, the symphony of existence, once a single resonant chord, became a sprawling, complex, and often dissonant composition. From the cold, timeless dark, the will watched. It observed the scattered fragments of its own consciousness, now encased in their prisons of clay and grammar, as they spread across the face of the world. It watched them build their own small, pitiful towers, castles of stone, empires of gold, philosophies of Inkeech, a faint, tragic echo of the one great structure they had almost completed. It heard their prayers, now a cacophony of pleas in 1,000 different tongues.